This is one of the coolest and most powerful lenses we've borrowed in years. It's the Tamron 35 to 150 f2 to f2.8. Everybody uses a lens combination called the Holy Trinity, which is the 16 to 35, the 24 to 70, and then the 70 to 200, all in f2.8. That is the Pro Holy Trinity. This spans that gap. So you could get by with your 16 to 35 ultra wide and this, and you'd be all set for things like travel and events. And that means you're carrying two lenses instead of three. But this also has an unusual aperture. While the traditional Holy Trinity, all those lenses have a fixed f2.8 aperture, meaning you zoom and the maximum aperture stays f2.8. This one, you could keep it at f2.8 all the time if you wanted, but you could also open it up to 35 f2. That means it almost has the same ability as a 35 millimeter prime lens. That, I think, is so cool. I'm so glad that Tamron thought outside the box a little bit. They decided to go with a variable aperture, allowing it to have more power. I'm testing this lens for everything: sharpness, contrast, bokeh, and it's overall amazing, but I found a couple of things you should know about before you buy it, so I'm going to help you make your decision. This is available for both Nikon mount and Sony E-mount. I think one of the biggest strengths of this is the ability to do courtside sports. So I don't mean like soccer or football. These are like field sports where things are a little bit further away. For that, I like to have usually a 70 to 200 with a teleconverter. So I'd like to be more like 100 to 300 millimeters. But courtside sports like volleyball, basketball, usually I'll have a 35 or 50 millimeter prime and then a 70 to 200 in case I might need to shoot across the court. But this sort of spans both of those. I could get a basketball player at the hoop if I'm under the hoop and be at 35 f2, still giving me pretty good background separation. Or I could zoom in to 150 and get close-ups of people that were a little bit further away. There are some gotchas with the sports. It focuses very well. I found it performed great tracking moving subjects. But with Sony cameras like the A1 or the A9 Mark III, the frames per second are going to be limited to 15 frames per second. So you won't get the 120 frames per second out of your A9 Mark III, and you'd have to go for the Sony 70 to 200 if you wanted something similar. And if you're dreaming of putting a teleconverter on it for those times when you do need to shoot field sports, right now that's not an option in either Sony or Nikon. The Sony teleconverter might fit, but Sony doesn't allow teleconverters to work with third parties, just an arbitrary artificial restriction. And the Nikon teleconverters don't seem to fit because the rear element is so close. I spent a lot of time with this just shooting general photography. Like we brought it to a car museum. It's kind of perfect for that. I don't shoot a lot of wide angles in car museums because it's so cluttered. I usually isolate things, and 150 is plenty tight, but the ability to go to 35 was also extremely useful. Without this, I would have really had two bodies, one with a 24 to 70 and one with a 70 to 200, but this was perfect. And the fact that it opened up to 35 f2 meant that I could get a little background separation on wider angle subjects when I needed to. As far as weight goes, it falls right between the Nikon 70 to 200, which is heavier, and the Sony 70 to 200, which is a little bit lighter. It balanced perfectly with the Sony bodies or with the Nikon bodies like the Z6, the Z7, the Z8, the Z9. If you're using a ZF with its very shallow grip, I don't recommend it. Either you should add a grip to your ZF or pick a lighter lens because it's kind of too heavy to balance on the ZF's skinny body. I know y'all want to see the sharpness, the contrast, the bokeh, the technical stuff. So let's get into it. Sharpness wise, I was stunned. I was actually stunned. This did so well, but we need to really compare it to two separate sets of lenses. So first I'll compare it to the Nikon 24 to 70 f2.8.
First, let's compare the sharpness against the Nikon 24 to 70 f2.8 at about 35 millimeters. In the center of the frame, the Tamron is a little bit sharper, which is amazing considering the price difference. Note that the moire caused by these fine lines is really wreaking havoc on the image quality, but more moire actually indicates a sharper lens. The moire is a property of the sensor, not the lens. Let's check out closer to the edge of the frame. Here, amazingly, the Tamron is significantly sharper than the Nikon 24 to 70, which is an incredibly sharp lens. Big win for Tamron. Let's check 70 millimeters versus the Nikon 24 to 70 first. Here I see better contrast with the Tamron lens than the Nikon, though they're both very good. Let's look at the edge of the frame. At the edge, again, the Tamron noticeably better.
Now let's compare it to the Nikon 70-200 f2.8.
At 70 millimeters, it's about a tie at the center of the frame, but maybe the Tamron looks a little bit better. At the edges of the frame, the Tamron is significantly sharper than the Nikon 70-200.
At 150 millimeters,
It's pretty much a tie. The Nikon is sharper by just a hair in the center of the frame. But if we move closer to the edges, it's a bigger win for the Nikon. What about those times when you need the 200 millimeters of reach? Can you get the same detail by cropping with the Tamron? It turns out, no. If you need to be at 200 millimeters, the 70-200 is a big win. It's significantly sharper, and you can't match that detail level just by cropping.
Now let's talk about contrast. That's really how well it handles having light shining straight into it. Lower quality lenses sort of bounce that light all around and they create a lot of bloom. And if you're shooting portraits at sunset with the sun behind your subjects, so they're not like squinting into the sun, this will handle it really, really well. But let's take a look at the actual results and how they compare to both the Sony and Nikon 70-200s.
I'm shocked by this, but the Tamron has much better contrast than the Nikon. Like, look at the bloom that comes out the side of the light here on the Nikon. It's much less pronounced on the Tamron. Zooming in 400% to look for chromatic aberration, that's magenta or green fringing. I see they both have a little bit, but I don't see that one has any more than the other, so I'll call that a tie. Comparing the Sony 70-200 to the Tamron 35-150, the Tamron again has a little bit less bloom, though the Sony is cleaner than the Nikon. Zooming in to look at chromatic aberration, the Sony has magenta chromatic aberration through here, while it's green on the Tamron, but they both seem to be equal amounts. Maybe the Sony has a little bit worse chromatic aberration. So here the Tamron solidly beats both the Sony and the Nikon. Pretty amazing.
Those contrast results really convinced me that this is an amazing lens for events. I definitely think I'd bring this for something like a wedding. Like, you could pretty much get everything done at a wedding, from walking down the aisle to the reception. The low light stuff with the 35 f2 would actually outperform a 24-70 f2.8 by a full stop. A full stop is like the difference between APS-C and full frame. So I really think having that wider aperture at 35 millimeters is really useful. But something I ran into shooting portraits and headshots with it is that this has pretty serious focal shrinking, what some people call focal breathing. In stills photography, when you zoom into 150 millimeters, it's a true 150 millimeter lens at infinity when you're focused as far away as you possibly can. But when a lens focuses closer, the optics need to move away from the sensor itself. It's just physically how focusing happens in a lens. And so as you focus closer and closer on internally focusing lenses like this, sometimes what happens is the optics shift and actually consume part of the focal length dedicated to the zoom. And thus, when you focus at something up close, 150 millimeters is actually more like 110 millimeters. That is a really significant difference. When you're working up close, you're going from a 4x zoom to a 3x zoom. That also means up close, you're not getting as much background blur as you could working with something like a 70-200 f2.8. You could add an extension tube like this. This is an extension tube. It's inexpensive and completely hollow, and it effectively moves the lens further away and allows you to focus at things up close. And that cancels out the focal breathing. This is what I use to test for focal breathing. But realistically, in event situations, you're not going to be able to throw on an extension tube in those situations, and you'll probably just move closer or have to crop in post. It's not a serious problem. It's just something to be aware of. The Nikon 70-200 also has very serious focal breathing. It's not quite as bad. The Sony 70-200 f2.8, the GM Mark II, is pretty good about focal breathing. It really doesn't shrink much at all. And if you look at these two pictures side by side, both taken at about 150 millimeters, you can see how much bigger the image is at that distance from the Sony than on this. Like, those are both 150 millimeters taken from the same place. But look at the difference in the size of the bokeh balls on the Sony, and that's how much this one is shrinking. Speaking of bokeh, let's go in and take a look at the quality of the bokeh compared to these two lenses.
Let's compare the bokeh of the Nikon 70-200 to the Tamron. And at this distance, we can see the Nikon has quite a bit of texture in the bokeh, and the Tamron is just a little bit cleaner. As we look in the corners, they both become very cat's eye towards the corners, which is okay. It's common, and it seems to be pretty equal. Looking at the edges of the Bokeh, they both have pretty hard edges, but none of them are soap bubble, so I'm going to call the Bokeh a tie. With that said, the Nikon can zoom into 200 millimeters and f2.8, and that means it can just produce bigger bokeh balls, as we see here. That can be a pretty huge difference depending on the situation. So if you do love bokeh, the 70-200 might produce bigger results for you. Compare the Tamron to the Sony 70-200. The bokeh on the Sony here is very round, whereas it gets clipped on the Tamron. The Sony GM lens also has the cleanest bokeh, the least texture, thanks to Sony's ultra smooth optics. It's even smoother than the Tamron's, which is still good. And if we compare the max bokeh we can get from the Sony to the Tamron, once again, you can see the benefits of being able to zoom to 200 millimeters.
Just one last test, and that's maximum magnification. It's related to minimum focusing distance, and it's really how big the subject can be when you get as close as possible. Here's what the results look like.
For maximum magnification, the Tamron came in a pretty distant third, unable to fill the frame with this little camera. The Nikon just about filled the frame, and the Sony was able to overfill the frame. Thus, if you do get the Tamron, you might also buy a couple of extension tubes for those times when you need to get close to things.
So who should get the Tamron 35-150? I think Nikon and Sony shooters who want a single lens that can cover events, courtside sports, and general travel photography. This can really replace two separate lenses, the 24-70 and the 70-200. So even though it's big and actually pretty expensive, it's a lot cheaper than buying two separate lenses. And I'm thinking about buying it for myself for when I travel, so I can just pack this and my 16-35 f2.8 and then just keep them on separate bodies. And buying one lens would effectively remove two lenses from my bag. I'm so happy Tamron is thinking outside the box with the focal lengths, because it really can change how you shoot. Now, it's pretty expensive at $1,800 for Sony or $2,000 for Nikon. Nikon's charging an extra tax on it for some reason, I guess. But that is way less expensive than even just the 70-200 f2.8s, not to mention it also largely replaces the 24-70. It's not available for Canon, and that is one big advantage of choosing either Nikon or Sony, the fact that you have more options for autofocus third-party lenses. Canon doesn't allow them at all right now, so big win for those of us shooting Sony and Nikon. Be sure to subscribe. We have more reviews coming up, lots of photography tutorials, and our live show every Thursday at 5. And if you want to learn photography, check out the books and video training we have available at northrup.photo. And if you have follow-up questions or thoughts on this, write a comment down below. Bye.